Okay, so I now have a continuous loop of fabric. So if, say, the letter that you're making doesn't just have one outside piece, you know, on the bigger pillows, they're going to have a couple of strips that you need to sew together. So you're gonna sew all the ends together to make one really big loop that goes all the way around until they're connected at the ends. So from there now, you might wanna fire up your iron and press this seam down. Press it flat. Now I'm just finger pressing it here because I don't actually have my iron turned on, and finger pressing does work if you have quilting cotton and you don't have your thing interfaced. So the next thing we're going to do is attach the letter to one of the letters, I should say, to this circle. So if you are used to making t-shirts or things with bands, you're used to circular sewing, then this should not be shocking to you. I think when you're making something like this that's really round, one of the best things you can do is find the quarter points. That will guarantee that you have things lined up and evenly dispersed. So when it comes to the circular piece, the outside loop we just made, where we've joined our seams, that's 1 quarter point. So if you want to, you can stick a clip right on that center seam. Then from there, fold your loop so that, you know, that center seam is there and the other side, and you're gonna mark that other side, which is going to be one of the quarter points. So then when you bring these two clips together that we just clipped, you'll have the other points right here on the sides. You don't have to do this. It's not actually in the pattern instructions, but if you have a very circular letter you're sewing, like a letter C or letter O or whatever, something like that, finding these quarter points is only going to help you. So now to find the quarter points on the O, we're gonna fold it in half and mark it and mark it, and then we're gonna fold it in half the other way and we're gonna mark it. Now this should really help us when we're lining up this to this, because what we're going to be doing is lining up with the right sides together this circle, and then we're going to be sewing it. So start with one of the quarter points. I think the top point or the bottom point, whatever we're calling, but the one that has the seam, I think that one's the easiest to start with. Clip that in place, then switch to the other side and clip those two in place. Now, if you don't have a circular piece, you're sewing something else on the outside, then you don't have to do any of this quarter point stuff. Follow the way I did the letter E for the outside. Follow those videos because they'll probably help you. A lot of the letters have the corners and the straight edges and things like the E does. So if that's more applicable to you, watch those videos as opposed to this really curvy O. And I should have said this before I even got really started in here. If you were doing piping or trim work for this letter, you would want to put the trim all the way around the letter, and the finished trim piece goes actually in towards the center, and then you're just going to curve it all the way around and stitch it down with, say, a zipper foot, something that allows you to really get in there. So go ahead and use trim, make these letter pillows exactly what you want, and enjoy them. Back to pinning and clipping. So now that we found the quarter points of this O, we should just be able to ease the rest of this outer edge into the rest of the space. And keep in mind, it doesn't have to be all the way up right next to the edge of the O like I'm pinning it. If it works better for you to not have it right there, that's fine, because there's going to be a 1/2 inch seam allowance of variation here. So, you know, if you're having trouble easing this in, you know, one side can be slightly longer than the other. I hope that makes sense. So see, like the bottom edge can be sticking out a little bit. But we're gonna finish easing the outside edge around the letter O. And once we've done that, we're gonna go and start stitching. Okay, so there we go. We have everything pinned around in the circle. And now we're just gonna go stitch around it. Here we are with our letter O. We're attaching the outside edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if this is your first time sewing in a circle, just go slow. If your sewing machine has the ability to adjust stitch speed, just turn it all the way down as low as it possibly can go. There's no sense in going fast. Easing 2 circular pieces together like this is just a slow process when you're starting out. And make sure to do some back stitches at the beginning and pull out the clips as you go. Also, you want to make sure that your pieces aren't jumbled underneath. So just, you know, give it a good feel on your fingers and make sure that the fabric of the O, the actual letter fabric, is flat under there, or you're gonna have some weird stuff happening when you're finished here. Flat is what we want. So just keep flattening and smoothing if you need to. I'm gonna have a weird fold if I don't flatten that out. There we go. Just slow and steady anytime you're sewing curves like this. Slow and steady just wins the race every time. You won't regret going slow and just taking your time around curves. It's not a race, but your sewing definitely will look better if you slow down. Okay, and back stitch when you get to the other side, and you're good. Okay, so I have just sewn one front of my letter to the outer edge. And something that's really beneficial before we turn anything is to do some clipping into our seam allowance, clip some notches into the seam allowance. This will really, really help when we turn this to the right side. It'll just make it so that that can be more crisp. Okay, just be sure not to cut through your seam allowance. I know it's probably hard to see because I used white thread here and the wrong side of my fabric is pretty white, but just don't clip through your seam allowance. Just make your little triangle notches smaller than the seam allowance. And if you don't have, you know, a full circle letter like a C or an O or whatever, or, you know, a full curve letter, I should say, and you have corners, like in the letter E, pillow, then you just want to clip the corners off entirely to cut down on seam bulk around the corners. But I'm sure if you have a corner or a straight edged pattern, you are watching the letter E pillow video, because it's gonna help you more than just this straight curvy one. Okay, so once you've notched everything and you feel good about it, You can go ahead and press this down with your iron so that it's nice and crisp. Pressing is one of those things that it doesn't seem like it would be a big deal for these pillows because they're pillows, but I'm going to tell you it makes a huge deal. So if you haven't pressed, go and press now and make it nice and crisp, because nice and crisp means that you're gonna have a beautiful pillow at the end. So I'm actually gonna go press. I'm gonna fire up my iron and press before we move on to the next part. Okay, so I've just ironed my O, and you can just see how nice and crisp it is from ironing. It makes a huge difference. So I'm gonna flip this back to the wrong sides for you again to be able to see it. So now what I'd recommend doing is marking the quarter points again for the O, or for really curvy letters. This time you're gonna do it on the other front/back piece, and you're gonna do it again on the outer edge, because we're gonna put the two faces, the front and the back face of this letter, together first before we tackle the inside. This is the quarter here. This is the quarter here. And now that we have all of the quarter points, we can do exactly what we did before. Stick these points together, ease them in, and clip them in place. So something that is mentioned in the actual pattern instructions is that if you need help aligning your back letter piece to the outer circle, you can mark it off with tailor's chalk or a pen, a fabric erasable pen. So, you could have marked the quarter points with pen as opposed to doing it with clips or pins. And I'm just easing this in, and sometimes easing means that, as I mentioned before, the fabric pieces aren't perfectly aligned. They're very close though. Okay. Now we're gonna go and sew around in the circle again at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so sewing the letter O, the second facing on, is going to be about the same as sewing the face on before, because they're exactly the same. So just go slow and steady, pull out the clips as you go, and make sure as you're sewing in this circle that both fabrics stay pretty flat and there's no bumping or bustling or anything that's happening that shouldn't be happening between these two pieces of fabric. If you do happen to get a bump or something, you can always rip out a couple stitches later on and smooth it out. It's not a big deal. It's always easy to fix. Get a bump or a bustle or something. All right, and back stitch when you get back to the starting point. We've just stitched the second facing on. And now we're going to do the same thing where we cut the little notches in the seam allowance to aid in the curvature of the O. Okay, now we can move on to the inside pieces. The next thing we're going to do is start assembling the inner edge. So we can move the pattern pieces, and we're going to do this the same way we did the outer edge by putting the short sides together and clipping them. And then we're going to go and stitch this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This is the inner edge assembly for the letter O pillow. Okay, we've just assembled the inside edge. If you are doing a slightly larger pillow, you may have to assemble 2 strips together, or if you are doing a letter that has 2 inserts, you'll need 2 separate inserts, one for the bottom, one for the top part. Like a number 8, for example, you would need 2 inside inserts. So now the first thing we're going to do is insert the pieces together. We can flip the right side out if we want to for the pillow, or we can flip, the right side of the inner part together. And now I do think that finding the quarter points again for this inside will help you just as much as it hopefully helped you keep things aligned for the outside. So if you don't mind finding the quarter points, I think it would be beneficial. And do that with the O as well. So you should be able to still find it. This is where you could use chalk to mark it off. And if you don't want to do all of the quarters, at least do the top 2 points, because that's going to be a huge benefit to you. Make it much, much smoother. Okay, so now we need to put our right sides together. So I'm going to feed this in here. And I want my seam to be at one of the top edges, aligned with where all the other seams are. Just for sanity, that will help us. You don't have to do it that way if you don't want to, but it's just what I recommend. And there's probably going to be quite a bit of easing that needs to be done to get this all lined up. Okay, so we're going to ease our inside edge to our letter as best as we can. And as I've mentioned before, the pieces don't have to line up perfectly. Like, see, this is a little bit overlapped here, a little longer on the one side. I just lost a clip and I don't know where it went, but that's okay. Do what you need to do to get the pieces to be together and to be flat. Now we're going to go and we're going to stitch all the way around that center piece at a 1/2 inch seam allowance.
we're stitching the inside portion of the letter O. And we want to go nice and slow again because we're easing around this curve and we don't want to have bumps. So just do your best. We're stitching at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Smooth everything out as you sew. Just make sure nothing is tangled under itself, or crumpled, I should say. There's a lot of smoothing out that you're going to do when you're working on these inside pieces for the letters. So just know that there's a lot of smoothing as you stitch. And we're almost back to where we started. Okay, so we've just sewn the first inside piece. If you have a lot of jumbles or bumps that you'd like to get rid of, you can do that. But I would recommend clipping into the seam allowance. Just doing the notches like we did before, this will really help when you do go to turn it. Okay, and you can press this down as well. This next part is the tricky part that I'm talking about. So flip everything right side out. Now push the center, the inside piece in. All right, so we should have the center in here coming out and the unattached edge. So what we want to do is find the point where that seam is. So I've got that right here, and I'm gonna just put a clip in on the front right here to mark it. But you could also draw on it as well. And then you want to find the part where the seam is on the inside. Okay, then what we need to do is we need to kind of like twist this around in such a way that we'll be able to clip the right sides together. So it's quite a bit of twisting to get it there, but it's important to do. And you're just gonna clip a couple more places, a little bit before and at the end. Okay, because as we sew, we're gonna continue to bring the center pieces and everything together, and we're gonna stitch around this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're gonna leave a 1/2 inch opening for turning. So it looks like a big lump, and you've only pinned a couple of pins, but the critical parts here are that the seams are lined up where they're supposed to be, so they're twisted around in that regard, and that the rights are together. Okay? Okay, so we're sewing the inside circle, 1/2 inch seam allowance, And we're gonna go really slow because as we sew, we're gonna be pulling the right sides together around this center. And this whole step is really kind of fiddly. So just do your best. We're almost back where we started. Almost. But the hole is for the stuffing. So just make sure you leave that. And backstitch.